So thank you everybody for coming. Before I get started on my talk, I just want to say thank you to the Center for the Study of the Middle East for inviting me to present some of my research today. I also want to extend a thank you to the Orange Jewish Studies program, which has provided very generous funding on various parts of my dissertation project, including for data collection and field work that I've conducted in the West Bank, both in the summers of 2016 and 2017. So with that, I'm going to kind of jump into things. I'm going to kind of try to keep it as short as possible to leave enough time for questions and comments at the end. What I'm going to talk about today, my talk is titled Unsettled Settlers, Explaining Variation in Israeli Settler Violence. And the talk today is covering a kind of portion of my larger dissertation topic. So, as Ambassador Zerbadi said, I'm interested in my dissertation in studying violence which is perpetrated by dominant ethnic groups against ethnic minorities, disadvantaged ethnic groups, right? Ethnic groups basically that are excluded from state power within divided societies. And for today, I'm going to kind of bracket the question of why this violence is likely to occur in the first place. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But what I'm going to focus on today is the question of once this violence begins to take place, right? Once kind of these violence interactions have begun, what accounts for the variation that we see in the level of violence that dominant groups are perpetrating and the forms of violence that these groups are perpetrating against ethnic minorities? So I'm kind of making an assumption here in terms of the kind of structural conditions that I'm interested in, right? I'm going to talk about dominant ethnic groups, right? So many studies of ethnic conflict tend to think about ethnic conflict in dyadic terms, right? Either what they're focusing on is this kind of leg of the triangle, right? Contests which are occurring between governments and groups which are kind of challenging the status quo, groups that are excluded from state power, right? Or what they're looking at is a case in which basically the government is absent, right? Or so weak that the government is basically ineffectual, right? And what ends up happening is you get competition between competing ethnic groups within this environment. But in reality, what you see in a lot of cases is a kind of case in which the government remains fairly strong, right? But can kind of be thought of in ethnocratic terms, right? So what do I mean when I say ethnocratic terms? What is kind of ethnocracy? It's basically a type of political structure, right, in which the state apparatus has been captured by one particular ethnic group, which we call the dominant ethnic groups, right? And this group basically uses the state's institutions, right, to further its own interests, to increase its own level of power, right, to increase its share of resources within the polity. Right, so what you see oftentimes in this type of context is actually a kind of triadic relationship in terms of ethnic violence. Right? What you have is a capable government, right, with fairly strong institutions, with a capable kind of security apparatus, which oftentimes is engaged in violent conflict with a challenging ethnic group, with an ethnic minority, with what I'm calling excluded ethnic group. But what you also see is that non-state actors from the dominant ethnic group also engage in violent activities, most often against members of the excluded ethnic group. Right, so what I'm interested in explaining here, and today what I'm going to focus on is dynamics of violence, violence that's being perpetrated by non-state actors within the dominant ethnic group against civilians within the excluded ethnic group. So in order to kind of approach this question, I adopt a kind of relational approach, right? And this approach basically builds on the proposition within the social movement literature that actions that are perpetrated by one movement or one actor, right, affect the subsequent behavior, the subsequent actions of other actors within the conflict, right? And more specifically here, what I'm going to be looking at is how governments' actions and excluded group actions in turn affect the type of violence, the level of violence that dominant groups are carrying out. Right? And specifically, what I theorize is that different kind of actions that are perpetrated by governments and excluded groups affect the level of perceived threat amongst members of the dominant ethnic group. Right? And in turn, these varying levels of threat affect the type of behavior, the type of violence behavior that they perpetrate. Right? So I build here on Stuart Kaufman's work, his 2015 book, Nationalist Passions, to differentiate between two types of threat. right? On the one hand, we have the type of physical threat that we tend to think about when we think about threat, which is a basic kind of threat to physical security. And on the other hand, right, we have a second type of threat, social threat, right, which is basically a threat to the privileged position, to the wealth, to the values, to the status of the dominant group within the polis. Right? And the question that I'm asking here is, how do varying perceptions of each type of threat affect the kinds of patterns that we see in dominant group violence against excluded group members? So I'm going to present about 5 hypotheses. Here I present 5 hypotheses which make predictions about how each form of threat affects the subsequent behavior of dominant ethnic groups. So the first 2 hypotheses basically posit that increase in the level of threat perceived by dominant group members is going to in turn increase their level of violence, right? And the basic argument here is that dominant ethnic groups, right, seek to reduce the level of threat in their environment, right? When they perceive that the level of threat is increasing, right, they are likely to carry out violence in a kind of attempt to reduce the threat, right? So the first hypothesis makes a prediction about the fact that events that signal an increase in the level of physical threat to members of the dominant group, right, are going to increase the overall level of dominant group violence, right? And the second hypothesis is that events that signal an increase in the level of social threat will also increase the overall level of dominant group violence. Now, it may be that both forms of threat are increasing kind of overall levels of violence, right? But it may also be that each type of threat differs in the kind of level of severity of the violence that it is likely to elicit, right? And there are 2 different ways in which we can kind of conceptualize this. Maybe, first of all, hypothesis 3, that physical threats have a greater effect on the level of dominant group violence than do social threats. Right? And it may also be that physical threats elicit more severe forms of dominant group violence than do social threats. Right? And this also builds on Stuart Kaufman's work. Right? He draws on terror management theory, which comes from social psychology, which basically makes the argument that when people are kind of cognizant of their own mortality, when they're facing these types of physical threats, right, they're likely to be more aggressive. There's likely to be higher support among the kind of general population for violence in order to kind of reduce the threat. People are likely to be more ethnocentric, more chauvinistic, right? And they're less likely to worry about the kind of effect of this behavior on innocent civilians that may get caught up, right? So both of these hypotheses make predictions about the kind of relative effect of physical and social threat on the severity of violence, both in terms of level, hypothesis 3, and in terms of the kind of forms of violence that we're likely to see, hypothesis 4. And finally, my 5th hypothesis builds on a kind of vein within the ethnic violence literature, which focuses on the symbolic nature of ethnic violence. Right? And again, Stuart Kaufman makes this argument that ethnic violence in response to social threats may be kind of more symbolic in nature, right? And I build on work that has kind of highlighted kind of symbolic targeting within ethnic conflicts, right? So for example, there's work that has highlighted symbolic violence in India, whereby they show that Hindus often target mosques and Muslim cemeteries because of the kind of symbolic significance that those targets have for the Muslim community, and that Muslims will carry out actions like slaughtering cows in Hindu villages because of the symbolic significance that cows have within the Hindu tradition, right? And so I posit that it may be that social threats, even if they're not as likely to elicit the same kind of severe forms of violence or the same kind of level of violence as physical threats, it may be that what they are doing is increasing the level of violence against kind of symbolically significant targets, right? So the first 2 hypotheses are basically making predictions about the effect of each type of threat on the overall level of violence. Hypotheses 3 and 4 are making predictions on the kind of severity of violence in terms of form and level. And then finally, hypothesis 5 is making this argument about the kind of symbolic nature of targeting that occurs in response to social as opposed to physical violence. So in order to test these hypotheses, I look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I'm most interested actually in one particular region within Israel-Palestine, that is the West Bank, which includes East Jerusalem, in my conceptualization. And what you see in this territory is basically the kind of classic ethnocratic state, right? A state in which basically one ethnic group, right, in this case, the Jewish population, is in control of the state apparatus, right? They actively use the state and its institutions to pursue their own interests, to increase their own level of power, right? To increase their own resources, their own share of resources within the polity. And in this case, right, I think it's particularly puzzling because you actually have a state with strong institutions, with a relatively strong coercive apparatus, right, which is pursuing the interests of the dominant ethnic group, right, the Jewish population, and yet you see that non-state actors from the Jewish ethnic group are still actively involved in violence against the Palestinian population, right? So in other words, what you see here is a kind of triadic case in which violence is constantly being perpetrated by the state, right, by the security forces, by the Palestinian population, right, which is challenging the kind of social order, the ethnocratic social order, and the Jewish population. And I think the difference here is particularly striking when you look at the West Bank, because of the kind of the difference that you see in the way that the populations are treated, right? So in the West Bank, as opposed to Israel proper, which I'm going to kind of bracket in this conversation, Israeli Jews are afforded full citizenship rights, whereas Palestinians basically live under military occupation, right? So there's a clear division between the ethnic groups within this territory. So just a few words about some trends that we've seen in Israeli settler violence before I get to the quantitative analysis portion of the talk. I don't really have time here to go through, and I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A, the kind of history of Israeli settler violence. But kind of brief history, right? You basically begin to see Israeli settler violence soon after Israel captures the territories, Jerusalem here and the West Bank in the war in 1967. Right? Very quickly, Israeli Jews begin to settle territories within the West Bank. Right? Settlements begins actually in the southern city of Hebron. For the most part, though, during this early period, settlers are settling in areas where there are very few Palestinians actually living. Right? There's very little contact actually between the two ethnic groups. Right? So in the early period, there's not much violence. The violence that is occurring is mostly occurring in the southern city of Hebron, where the two populations are actually coming into contact with one another. As settlement increases, as Jews begin to settle in densely populated Palestinian areas, right, interaction increases and violence increases as well. Now, one kind of trend that we've seen in Israeli settler violence is that there's been a move from kind of organized vigilante violence to a more kind of diffuse pattern of violence. What do I mean by that? So in the early period, most of the violence that was being carried out by Israeli settlers was being carried out by what are called in Hebrew kitot konenut, right? Basically, these quick action response forces, which exist in every settlement in the outpost, in which members of that community, usually prominent members of the community, volunteer, right, to defend the settlement against threats from the Palestinian population. And what this violence basically looked like early on was that when there were attacks against the community, when there were attacks against members of the community outside of the borders of the settlements themselves, these kitot konenut would quickly be called upon to come and respond to the violence, right? And so the violence was highly organized, right, usually coordinated with the security forces, and carried out by kind of prominent members of the community. Increasingly, right, as Israel engages in peace talks and then agreements with its Arab neighbors, right, as the perception that Israel may be willing to pull out of at least portions of the West Bank increases, right, this violence becomes increasingly diffuse. Right? Increasingly, young, radical, alienated settlers working outside of the kind of structure of the settler establishment, not coordinating with the security forces, begin to carry out violence themselves against the Palestinian population. Right? Increasingly, these young, kind of radical settlers have been called, they've come to be called the Hilltop Youth, this is kind of a misnomer, right? There is no real kind of organized group here. This is basically a moniker for any kind of young radical settlers who are carrying out violence outside of the kind of organized structure. So the first kind of pattern that we've seen is that there's a move away from kind of organized vigilante violence toward this more kind of diffuse pattern of violence. A second pattern that we've seen is that there's been a move away from violence being carried out by pro-government vigilantes, right, towards violence being carried out by anti-government activists. Right? So again, early on, these prominent members of the settlement community who were involved in these quick action response forces and these Kotonu, they saw themselves as part of the Israeli national project. Right? They saw themselves as part of the kind of larger security structure of the state of Israel. Right? They were invested in the state. Right? They supported the state program. But increasingly what we've seen is that, again, these young, generally referred to as hilltop youth, these young, kind of alienated radical settlers have turned against the state, right? And you can argue that this is largely caused by, again, these entering into peace agreements with Israel's Arab neighbors, with peace talks and peace agreements with the Palestinian population themselves, with Israel's disengagement unilaterally from Gaza in 2005, right? But for whatever reason, these young people have basically turned against the very notion of a modern, liberal, Jewish, right, national project, right? Generally, and this I found in my fieldwork, speaking to some of these people, what you hear is support for, in some kind of abstract way, a return to the kind of biblical model, right? Kind of anti-democratic sentiments, right? And kind of support for a Jewish kingdom on the entire kind of biblical land of Israel. Right? Now, this isn't to say that pro-government vigilantes are not carrying out any violence in the territory, right? This still does exist, right? But increasingly what you're seeing is actually violence being perpetrated, especially severe forms of violence, being perpetrated by Jewish settlers who actually oppose the state of Israel as much as they oppose the kind of Palestinian population. So with that in mind, I want to turn to the research design testing my 5 hypotheses. So the statistical model that I'm going to use here is a series of error correction models. This is basically a time series model based on a kind of simple linear OLS model. Why use an ECM model? Basically, these types of models are appropriate for testing hypotheses about how changes in the independent variables, right, produce changes in the dependent variables, right? So how these things are affecting each other over time. And one advantage here to using these type of models is that they actually allow you to distinguish between kind of contemporaneous, immediate effects of changes in the independent variables and changes in the dependent variables, and kind of lasting effects, how these things kind of move, these effects move through time. The unit of analysis for most of the regressions is going to be the conflict week. I do include a couple of models in which the conflict day is the unit of analysis. I'll talk about that for in a second. And the data that I use spans the time period from January 2010 through the end of 2015. The data comes from a kind of larger data set that I've built as part of my dissertation work. I don't have time to go through the data sources in the talk, but I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if anybody has any questions. So variables, dependent variables. So the first 3 hypotheses make predictions about the effect of physical threats and social threats on the overall level of dominant group violence, right? So in order to test these hypotheses, I include a dependent variable, which is changes in the number of settler attacks against Palestinian targets. Right? And this triangle here basically indicates that the variable has been differenced, right? That is, it indicates the change of the variable from time t-1 to time t, right? So first variable, and what you see here is basically a basic time series with conflict week as the unit of analysis of the number of settler attacks beginning in the start of 2010 through the end of 2015. To test hypothesis 4, right, that physical threats may elicit more severe forms of violence than social threats. I include 4 separate dependent variables, right? I disaggregate my measure of overall number of settler attacks. First, what I do is I differentiate between physical assaults and attacks which represent kind of destructions of property, attacks on Palestinian property. Right? The basic assumption here is that attacks on persons right, are more severe than attacks on property. There are two forms of attacks, however, that don't really fit neatly into this categorization scheme, right? The first are incidents of stone throwing, right? So this is basically where Israeli settlers throw stones at Palestinian vehicles on roadways in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, right? It's not clear here whether they're targeting the drivers. It's not clear whether they're targeting the vehicles, right? So it's difficult to include that in this basic kind of differentiation between attacks on persons and attacks on property. So I include it separately. And I also include another type of attack, which I call fire bombings. And these are attacks that have been adopted by some radical members of the Israeli settler community, whereby generally in the middle of the night, they sneak into Palestinian villages, toss a couple of Molotov cocktails into the windows of family homes while the family is sleeping. Right, these have resulted in Palestinian casualties. And again, right, it's not clear here exactly whether they're targeting the individuals inside the homes, whether they're targeting the property. But what I think is clear is that fire bombings are far more severe than our incidents of stone throwing, right? And this is definitely the way that these attacks are conceptualized within Israel by the government, by the Palestinian population, and also by the settlers themselves, right? So more severe forms of violence, physical assaults and fire bombings, less severe forms of violence, destruction of property, and stone throwing. Finally, to test hypothesis 5 about the effect of social threats on attacks against symbolically charged targets, I include a variable which captures settler attacks against Palestinian mosques. Right? Targets which hold a kind of special significance for the Palestinian population. Whether Palestinians are religious or non-religious, right? Mosques tend to be a kind of important cultural marker for the Palestinian population, especially when they kind of view themselves in opposition to the Jewish population within the region. Independent variables. So events that signal an increased level of physical threat, right? I include here a measure of Israeli settler casualties caused by Palestinian attackers, right? For the regression analysis, I include a binary measure here. I've run the model with the continuous measure, and it doesn't really produce any significantly different results. So basically what I'm capturing here is whether in a given week or a given day, depending on the model, a settler was killed by a Palestinian within the West Bank or East Jerusalem. In terms of events that signal an increased level of social threat, right, I include a measure of whether the Israeli forces have forcibly evacuated a Jewish settlement or outpost in a given week or day, depending on the model again. And basically what I'm capturing here are Israeli territorial concessions to the Palestinian population, right, which I theorize are likely to increase the kind of level of social threat, which was also borne out within my conversations with Israeli settlers during my field work. I include two control variables. I'm not going to talk about them now. I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A. But controls for the olive harvest, the month of October, and Israeli government approvals of new settlement housing, which may work to mitigate levels of Israeli settlement violence. So in terms of results, the first table uses as the dependent variable changes in the overall level of Israeli settler violence. Right? So what we find is that in terms of hypothesis 1, right, which predicts that physical threats, right, events that elicit kind of an increase in the level of physical threat should increase the overall level of settler violence, right, we find support for the hypothesis in all four models. I should mention, models 1 and 2 use the conflict day as the unit of analysis. Models 3 and 4 use the conflict week as the unit of analysis. You see a number of observations. The N for models 1 and 2 is 2,178, and for models 3 and 4, 312. So in all four models, what we find is that settler casualties do significantly increase the number of Israeli settler attacks against Palestinian targets, right? Both in the daily and the weekly models. And what we see here is that there is a contemporaneous effect, right? So there is a significant increase in Israeli settler violence during the day or during the week in which settlers are killed by Palestinian attackers. What we also find is that there's a lasting effect, right? So actually what we find is that the size of the effect increases the week after a settler casualty occurs, right, and persists for at least a couple of weeks after the attack. In terms of hypothesis 2, right, whether social threats increase the level of overall Israeli settler violence. We find partial support for this hypothesis, right? When we look at the daily models, we do see that settlement evacuations are likely to increase the level of violence on the day in which they occur, right? The effect does persist at a lower level of significance the following day, but basically disappears 2 days after the evacuation. If we look at the weekly models, right, there's no significant relationship between settlement evacuations and increases in Israeli settlement violence. So this gets us to hypothesis 3, right, whether physical threats, events that increase the level of physical threat, or the perceived level of physical threat, have a greater effect on the overall level of settler violence than events that increase the perceived level of social threat. Right? What we see, first of all, is that the coefficient for settler casualties is significantly larger, 3 times larger, right? So on average, settler casualties in a given day are likely to increase the number of attacks by 3 attacks, right? Whereas settlement evacuations are likely to increase the number of attacks by just over 1 attack on average. But we also see, right, when we look at the kind of persistence of the violence, that settler casualties are likely to increase violence for weeks after the incident occurs, right? Whereas settlement evacuations, right, are basically, the violence that they're eliciting is basically happening for the most part during the evacuation itself. And again, during field work that I conducted and interviews with Israeli settlers, they supported this kind of claim, that most of this violence that's occurring is basically occurring around the evacuation itself, right, in an attempt to try to prevent it from taking place. So overall support here for hypothesis 3. I'm going to leave the controls alone, but again, I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A. So to test hypothesis 4 and 5, first, in testing hypothesis 4, I include 4 models, right? In the first model, you have incidents of destruction of property as the dependent variable. Second model, physical assaults, stone throwing, and firebombing incidents. And again, what you see here is that settler casualties are likely to elicit a significant increase in all 4 types of attacks, right? And what's interesting here is that oftentimes when you look at the qualitative literature or you read about these kinds of attacks in the press, particularly these most severe forms of violence, these firebombings, people tend to associate them with settlement evacuations. But actually, when you look at the data, and actually during my conversations with Israeli settlers, right, this isn't really borne out, right? These most severe, especially physical assaults and firebombing incidents, tend to occur in response to attacks by the Palestinian population against Israeli settlers. The only form of violence here which increases in response to settlement evacuations is kind of one of the least severe forms of violence, these incidents of kind of stone throwing on the roadways. That's not to say that this violence is not significant. It's not to say that this violence doesn't cause harm, right? But compared with fire bombings and attacks on persons, right, I would argue that this form of violence is less severe, right? So again, the data seems to bear out hypothesis 4 that physical assaults do tend to increase they do tend to elicit severe forms of Israeli settler violence than do social threats. Finally, hypothesis 5 uses the dependent variable attacks against Palestinian mosques. And here we see the kind of opposite relationship, right? Settler casualties do not have a significant impact on attacks against mosques, these particularly kind of symbolic targets, right? In fact, we see that the coefficient is negative, right? This isn't significant, but there's some indication that maybe there tends to be fewer attacks on mosques when Israeli settlers are actually targeted by Palestinian attackers. But we do see a positive relationship between settlement evacuations and this form of violence, right? Settlers are more likely to attack Palestinian mosques, not only during weeks in which settlements are evacuated, but this actually persists into the future, at least during the following week, where you also have a positive relationship between settlement evacuations this type of violence, these types of attacks against Palestinian mosques. So kind of just to conclude, I think what's kind of interesting here, right, is beginning to tease out and test the kind of different effects that two forms of threat are having on dominant group violence in particular here, but one could extend this possibly to other actors as well, right? And basically you see that both physical and social threats are having a kind of effect on the violence that these actors are perpetrating, right? But it's important to keep in mind the differences, right? Physical threats are going to increase the level of violence. They're going to increase the kind of severe forms of violence to a greater degree than are social threats. But social threats may actually create incentive for dominant group members to carry out these kind of highly symbolically charged acts of violence, right, that can be particularly incendiary within these types of ethnic conflicts, right? And I think kind of going forward, I've kind of dealt with, I've made an argument that both types of threat are kind of happening contemporaneously within the conflict. But I've kind of dealt with each one of them separately and compared them to one another. And I think going forward, it may be interesting to look at how these two types of threat actually play off one another in a kind of process, right? So in the Israeli case, is it the case that settlement evacuations increase attacks against mosques, which then work to increase Palestinian violence against the settler community, which then heighten the kind of level and severity of forms of violence that we see? So looks like I'm out of time. I'm going to leave it there. But I want to thank you guys for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
So first of all, thank you. That was very insightful. My one question I have to, can you describe the data sources, like your methodology? You mentioned that you did field work for 2 summers, as well as how you got the sources from the news or whatever. And my second question is, I was reminded by a quote from Hannah Arendt, who said that people tend to think of violence as an assertion of power, but in many ways it's a substitute, and it comes about when there is not a firm understanding of who's in power or in control. Do you think that your analysis might verify that kind of like more abstract claim?
Yeah, so if you could actually just take that up, I'll have something to say about that. So I'll take your first question and then your second question. So in terms of data sources, just dealing with kind of variables here. In terms of settler violence and Israeli approval of new settlement housing, this data comes from daily reports that are put out by the what's called the Palestinian Monitoring Group. They put out the daily situation reports that are available online. If anybody's interested, I recommend you check it out. They're incredibly interesting. They've been collecting this data beginning in 2008. There were a lot of kind of missing data problems from 2008 to 2010, which is why I began my analysis using data from 2010. But they basically get their information from a variety of governmental, non-governmental agencies operating in Palestinian territories. The information on settler casualties comes from a list that is compiled by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's available on their website. They include all Jewish casualties, both military and civilian, which have occurred throughout the conflict, and kind of circumstances of those casualties. And then information about settlement outposts and evacuations was collected through media reports. So I looked at 3 Israeli media sources from kind of across the political spectrum: Haaretz on the left, Jerusalem Post center right, and Arutz Sheva, which is kind of a settler publication on the far right. And I used a variety of search terms within the databases of all 3 newspapers to build my list of settlement and outpost evacuations. In terms of whether or not, I think, correct me if this isn't your question, whether or not actors are likely to perpetrate violence when their kind of position is somewhat uncertain, right? Yeah, I think that that's kind of the argument I make in terms of the structural argument about why this violence occurs in the first place, which I bracketed in the discussion here. But the basic argument that I make is within ethnocratic regimes that are trying, on the one hand, right, to institute a kind of democratic order, right? But this democratic order is really focused on one subgroup within the state, right? A kind of ethnically conceptualized nation, right? So in this case, a democratic order for a Jewish state. There's a kind of contradiction there, right? And this, in some ways, is kind of internal contradiction of Zionism, right? Where they're trying to be on the one hand democratic and on the other hand Jewish, right? And you know, I think this was tamped down in the early years to some degree as they were trying to kind of build this kind of Jewish project, the Zionist project, the state of Israel. But as more and more time has passed, it's been more and more difficult to kind of keep that from kind of bubbling over, right? So yes, I think as Israel has worked to kind of institute democratic reforms, as they've tried to kind of normalize relations with their Arab neighbors and with the Palestinian population, when they try to increase rights or provide concessions to the Palestinian population, you do see a kind of increase in the perpetration of violence by Israeli settlers who are less and less sure about the certainty of their position within the polity. So yeah, I mean, in a kind of larger sense, I would, especially if you're talking about the occurrence of the violence, I would kind of agree with that. Yeah.
Yehuda, in doing the research, did you have interviews with any of the perpetrators? Do you have any subjective information, impressions, comments, other than the data set?
Yes, so I interviewed about just over 40 settlers. A number of them were involved in violent incidents themselves. Some of them were actually leading this violence. I spoke to a number of people who had spent time in Israeli prisons, some of them in solitary confinement due to their violent behavior, especially when they actually perpetrated violence against Israeli targets, Jewish targets, military targets, not just Palestinians. Yeah, I mean, general impressions, I think, first of all, a lot of them did point to the importance of threat in their activities. So when they did perceive, they didn't use this language, but when they perceived kind of these types of social threats that were coming from government actions primarily, and physical threats from the Palestinian population, they were more likely to kind of respond with violence. Another thing that I kind of gleaned from them was that most of the violence tends to be carried out, and I think this is not just unique to this case, carried out by young people, right? So basically, a lot of these people, once they have children, get married, they are less likely to themselves be involved in the violence, right? But are likely to act as mentors to other young people who are perpetrating the violence themselves. Yeah, and one other thing was that there's a kind of reluctance amongst most of the population to target Jewish targets, right? So one of the questions I have is why aren't they targeting both Palestinians and Jews, right? I think there are two different reasons for this, right? They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. One, there are kind of clear identity boundaries which are maintained by this population, right? Where they see a clear and important difference between the Jewish population and the Palestinian population. They may disagree with particular governments, Jewish governments, they may disagree with left-wing activists, but they see them as qualitatively different than Palestinian targets. In other words, they want to bring them on board rather than engage in open conflict with them. Right? And the other reason is that the government responds very differently to attacks on Jewish targets than it does attacks on Palestinian targets. Right? So settlers who carry out attacks against military targets or against Jewish targets are heavily repressed by the government. They basically begin to treat them as if they are part of the Palestinian population. Right? They treat them as they would treat Palestinians. And settlers very quickly come to realize that if they want to carry out violence and they want to avoid the kind of repercussions, the consequences that come out with carrying that violence, right, it's in their interest to carry out the violence against the Palestinian population and not the Jewish population or the military.
In this case, we're talking about Israel is characterized as an ethnocracy. The group that's being excluded is Palestinians without citizenship, and the group that's doing the excluding is settlers, which is in some ways a predefined group from whom we expect direct, non-subtle acts of exclusion. And in this case, we're talking about violence as a method of exclusion. Inside of Israel, we have Palestinians who have citizenship. It's still an ethnocracy, and the excluding group is less clearly defined. And coming from sociology, I would start to talk about mechanisms that prevent Palestinians from getting higher education rather than. Can you sort of pull out more about that parallel?
Yeah, so it's a good question, one that I struggled with, right? Ian Lustig actually wrote a book about the quiescence of Israeli Arabs, Palestinians with Israeli citizenship living in Israel, which kind of tries to deal with this question. I think an important factor is actually that you have both situations going on at the same time, right? So like with the land grant protests in Israel proper, there were early on the beginnings of kind of uprising amongst Israeli Palestinians within Israel proper. But I think importantly, the Israeli Palestinian population, which I'll call Israeli Arabs, which isn't really, just to distinguish them from the Palestinian population living in the West Bank, right? That they are perceptive of the kind of difference between themselves and the Palestinian population living in the West Bank without citizenship rights, right? And I think there's a reluctance to engage in kind of open challenges to the regime. But you do see some level of challenge, right? There have been attacks that have been perpetrated by Israeli Arabs against Jews in Israel proper, but many fewer than you see in the West Bank. But my suspicion would be that if the situation in the West Bank was resolved, that those kinds of challenges would begin to bubble up in Israel proper, right? Once they don't have that comparison to make with the kind of more disadvantaged population in the West Bank, right? I think that you'd start to see increasing challenges coming from the Israeli population.
So violence from settlers is pretty much reactive in that sense.
Yeah, I think it's,
Whereas exclusion inside Israel is reactive.
Well, the exclusion is not necessarily just coming from the settlers in the West Bank, it's coming from the government as well, right? But yeah, I mean, overall, I think the phenomenon of Israeli settler violence has been reactive, and that's what you tend to see with kind of counter-mobilization, right? So violence really, in a kind of serious way, doesn't really begin in the West Bank until there are kind of increasing attacks against the settler population. The settlers some of these kind of violent networks do start to mobilize in response to peace negotiations that are going on between Egypt and Israel in the 1970s, but it's not until there are a number of kind of terrorist attacks against the community that these networks that have already mobilized but hadn't begun to carry out attacks actually begin to perpetrate violence themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about your basic conceptualization. It seems like the attacks that the Palestinians or the government's movements or the independent variable, but it seems like those are also in reaction to your dependent variable. And I was wondering what kind of feedback process, or is something completely different causing the Palestinian attacks than whatever settlers do?
Yeah, so actually when I run regressions, looking at that a little bit, I think it's a good question, one that I haven't totally teased out yet. But I think that when I have looked, and you see the same kind of patterns occurring actually in Northern Ireland. I've looked a little bit at the patterns of violence between loyalists and Republicans in Northern Ireland, that the excluded group doesn't really seem to be reacting so much to the dominant group, right? Mm-hmm. So they tend to be reacting to government repression, kinds of concessions or repression that the government is kind of carrying out, which is relevant to their community, but very little reaction to the actions of the dominant ethnic group, which I think is interesting in and of itself. Right? So I don't have a good kind of definitive answer for you. I think that's something that I'm still kind of working on teasing out. But I have found, as I've kind of begun to look at that they do seem to be reacting to different things, right? The excluded group tends to be reacting to the government, right? And the dominant group tends to be reacting to actions of the excluded group itself, right? So it's not this kind of neat relationship between the two where they're just kind of reacting to one another back and forth in this kind of tit for tat relationship. But I think it is more important to I think it's important as I go forward to kind of think about those feedback loops in the triangle and kind of better understand how these things are moving.
Fascinating, especially for government policy.
Yeah.
So something else that I want to push on is this idea that there is variable threat, not only threat levels, so the physical and social threat, but there seems to be a threat perception story going on here too, where there may be a difference between real threat versus perceived threat. And then here comes the question of who is shaping the threat, or how does threat perception kind of vary amongst the dominant group settlers, and I guess that's another thing that I want to push you on, is that you kind of black box the Israeli government right now, and for the case of this analysis, which is fine, but overall, how do you differentiate between how maybe there may be diplomatic policies that shape the settler violence behavior differently than, let's say, IDF policies or security policies? Something else that I wonder is, what role does the IDF play in either, promoting this culture in which, or promoting an idea that, this this norm that like settler violence may be okay, or maybe turning away, or maybe not repressing them, or choosing to repress at some times versus others. So I kind of like wonder if you could answer to that a little bit.
Sure. So first, in terms of the first question about other factors that may be affecting the kind of perceived level of threat. Now, in terms of real threat, perceived level of threat, I think that in terms of explaining the behavior, I think the perceived level of threat is what's important here, right? Because that's what's actually going to drive behavior. What's kind of objectively happening is less relevant here with this question because what they're perceiving is what's actually going to affect their subsequent behavior. In terms of other factors, so yeah, in a previous project I did look at how peace negotiations may affect settler violence. There's less of a kind of clear relationship, but I did find that particularly when the government takes concrete steps, right? So there have been peace negotiations that have been going on for decades. They don't really go anywhere. People don't really take them seriously. This was kind of borne out in the interviews that I conducted as well. But when the government takes concrete steps, like the settlement freeze that Netanyahu put in place in 2010, you did see a spike in Israeli settler violence, right? So there is an indication, and going forward, I think this is important to think about, kind of what are some other factors that are increasing the levels of perceived social and physical threat within the environment, right? This is not limited to, in this case, I looked at two factors in particular, but it's not limited to those two factors, right? Things like negotiations or concrete steps as part of negotiations, as part of the peace process, or signing a peace deal may also have an effect, right? Another example is after the Oslo Accords were signed, right? You saw a huge spike in Israeli settler violence, right? This is when the kind of most notorious attack in the Ibrahimi Mosque, Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron occurs, right? Where a radical Israeli settler by the name of Baruch Goldstein goes into the mosque in the middle of prayer and guns down dozens of Palestinians, right? Over 100 people are injured in the attack. And the attack is only stopped, basically only ends when the mob kind of overtakes it, right? So in terms of other factors, yeah, I think you can look at other factors that are increasing the kind of perceived level of threat. In terms of the relationship between the government or the security forces and the Jewish settlers, there tends to be a very close relationship between the two. So I also became interested in this topic personally during my service as a combat soldier in the Israeli military in the West Bank. And we were closely coordinating with Israeli settlers. We were housed in Israeli settlements and were ordered many times to kind of turn a blind eye when Israeli settlers were perpetrating acts of violence. So whether or not this changes over time, I think that would be an interesting thing to look at. There has been some increased arrests and repression of Israeli settlers, some of the most radical elements in the Israeli settlement movement by the Israeli police, right? Not actually by the military. But generally in the courts, these cases don't really go anywhere.
As a quick follow-up,
Yeah.
could you consider that relationship similar to the relationship between states and informal militias?
Yeah, so to some degree. So when I talk about the Kitot Konenut, these quick action response forces, I think those really can be conceptualized as pro-government militias, right? They're coordinating with the state, they're funded by the state, they're using the state's technology. But when you're talking about some of this kind of more diffuse violence, these hilltop youth, right, quote unquote, where there is very little coordination with the state and where they actually oftentimes are opposed to the state itself or opposed to the security forces, right? Then you're kind of moving into another area. And I think both of these things are kind of happening simultaneously, which is interesting, right? Because there has been a movement in the literature to look more at pro-government militias and the relationship between them and the state. But I think it's important to realize when we're looking at the group level that even if you have these militias operating, there's actually a lot of violence that is occurring outside of the kind of militia structure, which is significant as well. Yeah. You're next.
This is a methodological
Just
question.
two more questions, I think, and
Okay,
then we'll
sure.
wrap up.
This could be really short.
Okay.
So you both interviewed people and you collected data and,
Yes.
and ran some statistical stuff.
Yeah.
Did they give you different results? And if they did, why did you do both? And which one do you believe more than the other?
So no, actually they haven't really given me very different results.
So why do you do both?
So I do both because basically the statistical models allow me to determine kind of correlation. And in order to really kind of tease out the mechanisms at play here, what's really going on the ground, I really felt like I had to talk to people, which was incredibly useful, right? So I can say that, attacks against Israeli settlers are increasing the level of settler violence, but to really answer the question as to why that's occurring, right? I need to understand, to talk to the settlers on the ground and understand what the processes are for them.
So why didn't you just talk to people and forget about the numbers?
Well, can I trust them? You can't always trust the people on the ground. So there's more confidence when these two things are actually correlated. Yeah.
Yeah, I find that very interesting that two things. That one, you found a very close relation actually between the perceived threats against settlers or actually killing of settlers and their violence. And the other thing that you said that the settlers who perpetrated violence, they often, even sometimes the Israeli army or so close eyes maybe, or one eye at least, but it goes against the interest of the Israeli state. And there has been an increasing conflict within the Israeli society saying, well, what do we care so much about these kind of settlers? So there is a conflict in between. And because you made initially this claim that this is just a case study, that's also applicable to other conflicts. So when I try to compare that to Germany and attacks on the refugees today, so we have those who do the attacks are mostly from the far right, and they also pose a problem for the German government because that is well perceived in the international news. But still, on the local levels, you have people who are rise and police and so on. But it's not in correlation, at least I don't know of any study has shown a correlation that there are attacks by refugees against these far-right people. So in other cases, apparently there are other factors that are more ideological than maybe in that case.
Yeah.
So so my question is that, do you want to try to apply that also to different conflicts, or which ones?
So yeah, that's a good question. So yes, I do want to apply to other conflicts. As I mentioned, I've been starting to look at the case of Northern Ireland, which kind of closely overlaps in the kind of structure with the Israeli case. I think a case like apartheid South Africa would also be interesting, right? A clear kind of ethnocratic state. A case like Germany is interesting. And European and American cases as well, right? When you talk about kind of right-wing militias in the United States that have carried out violence. I think the reason that you see far less violence in these cases, right? You see far less violence being perpetrated by kind of members of right-wing organizations in Germany against immigrants that you see by settlers against Palestinians, right? Who are carrying out violence every single day, right? There is not a day that goes by without significant. Yeah. So that's interesting. That'd be interesting to look at. But I think that when you see, and this also comes out of Stuart Kaufman's work that I build on here, when you see physical threats, right? Threats to physical security, you're likely to see a kind of increased overall level of violence. So social threats may elicit violence in and of themselves, right? And I think that's more of what's going on in Germany, right? That there are kind of at least perceived social threats to the culture, to the kind of dominant position of the kind of the German population, the native German population. And those may elicit some form of violence. But I would expect that if you started to see kind of a high number of incidents of violence by refugees against native Germans, that you would see a real spike in the level of violence being carried out by Germans against refugees. So again, I think it's important to look at both of these forms of violence. Now, yeah, I mean, the only way to know that is if these violent events start occurring, which I hope do not occur. But that would be my expectation, right? That if in a case where you see high levels of physical threat, you're likely to see high levels of violence. Social threats may also increase the level of violence, but I think they're more likely to increase these kind of symbolic forms of violence than they are kind of more severe forms of violence. So was that it? That was the cutoff?
You've got one. Is there one more?
Anybody else have a question?
I'll give you because you haven't actually gone a full hour. I started a little late, so if there's another question. Thank you very much.
Take her. Go for it.
All right, I thought it was a fun one, and just because you spent a lot of time in the West Bank and with these settlers,
Sure.
Was there any particular story or incident you had that was particularly interesting or unusual that happened to you in such a charged environment?
Interesting and unusual story in the West Bank. During my field work, you're asking me.
Yeah.
Not during the military service. I generally, well, I shouldn't actually. That's a good question. Yeah.
Wasn't going to be the hardest one either.
Well, you know, what to pick out. So I think one thing that was really interesting that I found, it's not exactly something that happened to me, but something that I learned while I was there, is the impact of kind of American culture on some of these activities, right? So something I'd actually never heard about when I was living there before I started to speak to some of these settlers that had been involved themselves in some of these violent activities, was that a lot of them in the early years, so in the 1990s, you start to get this kind of hilltop youth movement starts to form. Right? We generally tend to think of that as forming after the Second Intifada, right? But actually, if you speak to people, this actually begins earlier. Basically, these young settlers going out on their own on the hilltops on horseback and setting up kind of these undefended outposts. And we generally tend to think of this as a kind of Israeli phenomenon. But actually, there was a group of settlers who called themselves the American Gang, who were all children of American parents who had moved to the settlements in the 60s and 70s. They were congregated in the southern city of Hebron. And they, in their youth, started to follow this, his name now escapes me, I have it written down, but this American Korean War vet, who they basically call the cowboy. Right, who basically came in with this kind of, what they describe as this cowboy kind of attitude, where he would basically ride around on horseback, right, with a cowboy hat on, his jeans, everything, ride into Palestinian villages, set up hilltops, right, and basically had this kind of, I think he was a little, had a little bit of PTSD after the Korean War, the way they described it, and basically decided that this was his land and he was going to do with it whatever he saw fit. Right, and they actually started to follow him. They started to see him as a mentor, right? And they started to follow his example, set up these kind of small hilltops, and also begin to kind of perpetrate violence as part of this kind of process. So that's something that I actually found really interesting, right? When we think about the American influence in the settlement movement, there was a recent book which was just published, which talks about how kind of some liberal notions from American peace activists in the 60s kind of found their way into the kind of settler ideology. But nobody really talks about this other fact, that this kind of hilltop phenomenon, this kind of settlement phenomenon, is actually really influenced in some ways by the kind of Western kind of frontier culture in the United States. So that was one thing.
Thank you very much. A fascinating.